I'm Andrew Deutz, Managing Director of Global Policy with WWF. We're here today to talk about synergies between climate change and biodiversity. So we're going to start off with some opening remarks from my colleague Manuel Pulgar, and then we'll have a panel of experts looking at national experiences and international experiences on collaboration and coordination and synergies between climate and biodiversity, and then some closing remarks from my colleague Adil Najam. So again, welcome to a conversation about synergies on climate and biodiversity, and let me hand the floor over for some opening remarks to Manuel. And when we're done, we'll call the panelists up.
Good. Thank you, Andrew, and hello to you all. I am so happy to be here to discuss climate and nature synergies. So, I was thinking on what to bring. I was trying to bring the salsa from Cali, but it is very difficult. Or probably the guarbes of Cali, but also that is probably even more difficult. So, I will just bring to you some words. So it is what I can do for today. So when it is about how can we take what we have just received from Cali, there are many, many things to say. Let me start by saying that this idea of peace with nature, I think it is a good concept because we have to reconcile our relation with nature. And that relation, it is nature with people, nature with the economy, nature with politics and policies, but also nature with climate. No? So the idea of getting peace, it is when we can connect dots, when we can bring together all those elements as a way to define more clear policies or to explore some more effective avenues to address the climate and biodiversity crisis. And when it is about climate and nature, we have to consider what we have just said in our Living Planet Report 2024. That, by the way, I suggest you to read it. It's a fantastic, fantastic document. For me, the best ever Living Planet Report. And you know why? Because it is not just an index, that it is showing how much we are losing species, 73% in average in between 1970 and 2020, so in 50 years. But also because it is a warning system, it is an early warning system that it is defining three main tipping points, the coral reef, the subpolar gyre, plus the Amazon. But also it is defining system change, the need to walk the energy or to change the energy system, the food system, the financial system, and I am missing one of those. Okay, and our conservation actions. So it is an important document. So based on that, it is that we have to recognize that we have to act. And the best way to do it, it is by connecting our nature effort with our climate objective. And why? Because science has already told us that. No? You remember this IPCC report on the certification, that it has already shown what is that relation in between our climate, land desertification, and droughts, no, objective. But also IPCC has already mentioned as the 5 transitions that we have to walk: the energy, the industry, the cities and infrastructure, transport, and the land use, deforestation, and agriculture one. So one of those transitions, it is related to nature. But also soon, probably after this COP, IPBES will release something about systemic transformation. So I hope that we can connect all that scientific information, that it is the baseline for our action. But also because when it is about climate and nature, climate has already sent good signals. I think that it was in COP25 in Madrid, organized by Chile, that we got that first good recognition on the importance of connecting climate and nature. We did the same in COP26, 27, and even in COP28 in the UAE consensus, that it was so instrumental to move that. And later I will talk a bit about COP16 decision on climate and biodiversity. But also because we have to recognize, no, sorry, let me say this in the political side, that for sure it is not that we have to merge conventions. That is not correct. No, that is not the idea. I think that we have to put out of our mind the idea that we will merge conventions. Even I think that it is not fair to criticize what we did in 1992. I think it was a correct decision to have those 3 Rio conventions because it was the beginning of a process. It was a time in which we were thinking, how can we give maturity to the topics? And I think that things are evolving well at a level of maturity that we can merge effort. We can join effort, more than merge. We can join effort. And that is the idea of the climate and nature synergies. It is not to merge convention, but to join effort. And for what? To be more effective in our outcomes, to be more coherent in our actions, to be more effective in connecting dots around our institutional framework, to save resources, to promote more awareness because the synergies can connect with people. So there are many, many reasons because we have to promote those kind of synergies. But also because we have some key instruments as nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions that it has already gotten political recognition in UNEA 5 in 2022. It is one of those instruments that can help us to address climate and biodiversity objectives. So there are many, many reasons. I don't have too much time to go deeply because that is why we have today a panel. But let me say something to end about the call from Cali. So Cali COP16, as you know, it was a COP in which many, many things were debated. One of those, it was the biodiversity and climate decision that fortunately it was adopted. And what this decision it is saying, that we have to join efforts in, for example, the planning process. No, we have to put more closer NDCs with MBSAPs, but also that includes, for sure, long-term strategies. So it is not just about the NDCs. And I hope also national adaptation plans. So all the planning system, it has been developed in a more collective way, in a more cooperative way. So that is something that it was fortunately adopted. Then that decision mentioned that we have to adopt safeguards in the climate and in the biodiversity as a way to avoid to have negative effect of our action. Third, a very modest clause, a very modest paragraph saying that we have to mobilize resources for the synergies. And finally, the most important, that the CBD will explore avenues to put the 3 conventions talking each to other. That could mean a dialogue, that could mean to share information, or a joint work program. That is something that it has been mentioned. So Cali has already sent the call. More than a call, a request. So we have to work here in Baku to take that call and also to take a decision, okay? That is so, so important. I think that this debate, it is not just to discuss how important it is, but to know what should we push for. And in this case, I think that we have to move all of our allies here to say we have to respond to that call, because by having in the 2 places, plus in Riyadh, in COP16, soon later in Riyadh, we will have all the baseline to put those conventions to talk each other, to plan together, and to implement with whole of society, because that is so important. So thank you very much for this opportunity, for this opening, and very, very happy to have you all, and I am sure that we will have a fantastic panel. Thank you, Andrew.
Oops, thank you very much. Whoops. All right, I'm going to call the panelists up. In the spirit of adaptation, we've had a few changes in the program, so bear with us. But if I can just call up, and we'll fill up the panel now, Margarita Gutierrez, who is a climate change advisor to the Colombian government, coming from IISD. Mechthild Kaspers, who is the head of the working group on climate policy in the land sector in BMUV, the German Ministry of Environment. Alexandra Prado is the climate change leader in WWF Brazil. Anite Mills from the climate change specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank, and Alexandre Desprez from head of climate governance at IDRI. So I'm going to take a step on the side here, just to frame the conversation a little bit. We're now at COP29. I was at COP1, so I've been doing this for a while. And back then, climate change was primarily an energy issue. And those of us who worked on forests and nature were kind of like, oh yeah, that's an afterthought, those greenies over there, this is an energy conversation. But the climate world has evolved significantly now. I think it's a truism to say that we can't solve the climate crisis without solving the biodiversity crisis and vice versa. But there are challenges and trade-offs in how we do that. Where I live in the United States, there's an ambitious plan to build out the renewable energy infrastructure to meet the Paris goals. Hopefully those will stick. But building out the renewable energy infrastructure is the single largest threat to intact habitat in the United States. So how do we manage that trade-off and do that planning? The CBD has actually provided guidance on infrastructure sustainability in Decision 14.3. We need some guidance on the climate world. At the COP in Cali, as Manuel said, we got a decision that looks at how do we do those trade-offs and synergies? How do we do the planning? And it talks about, I think, two levels of coordination at the global level, what happens between the different conventions and the planning processes at those conventions, and where the rubber hits the road, which is what happens at the national level and the subnational planning, and how do those decisions get coordinated? Some of my colleagues at WWF just produced a new report called Breaking the Silos, which is just about that level of integration. I think probably the single most important recommendation in that report is saying you need an interministerial coordination process so that we do break down those synergies, because the planning can't happen in a silo, because if you're planning for climate and biodiversity, you basically need a comprehensive land use sector, and that means biodiversity, climate, agriculture, land use, all of it at the table at the same time. So we're going to take a look here at sort of how that played out at both the national levels and the international levels. So let me start first with Margarita, since you've been working and advising the Colombian government on how to do this, where there's been a lot of progress. And first I'll say congratulations to Colombia on getting us the decision on synergies at Cali a few weeks ago. So what has been the experience in Colombia on doing the integration across NBSAPs, NDCs, et cetera?
Thanks. Okay. Thank you for having us in this excellent pavilion and excellent panel, and thank you to my panelists that are with me. And sorry because the government of Colombia is the whole in plenary, so they can came today in this moment. So yes, I think that the one most important thing that we have been discussing is that we need a clear and understanding framework where the mitigation hierarchy application is extensively and is well done, and we have enhanced the capacities of the licensing process to understand how these trade-offs are going to develop in the field. We have been developing some term of reference for a specific infrastructure that has to deal with lessing the carbon and making our development more eager to adopt energies, new energies, but that we need to bear in mind that we have to take the importance of biodiversity and the impacts that they are producing also in other indicators and variables. One of the main important things that we have discovered and studied also in this integration of NDC and NBSAPs is that we have silos even between inherent to our institutional arrangement, and that even within the Ministry of Environment, within the institutional officers of environment in the subnational regions, there are differences and there are not connections that we need to put together now and that we need to understand. Because if we as an environmental sector wanted to talk about other sectors in planning and in long development strategies, we need to see that there are not experts on environment, and we need to put together just one pitch and one framework to convince them that this is a better future that we are doing. And we can go without different pitches related to biodiversity and related to climate change, because they are going to confuse them and they are going to reduce the action that they wanted to build together. So I think that in the NBSAP that we see, it's a very challenging focus on planning, and territorial planning in Colombia has been always a challenge. There are a lot of challenges related to coordination between different levels of the government, but also different sectors. And we have developed from 2020 a national commitment where all the sectors and all the levels came together and trying to develop a whole guidelines related to national and subnational planning levels. This hasn't been so effective as we wanted, but we now need that is the path forward. One of the challenges that we also integrated is the information. There are a lack of information. There are different levels of information, and we have been designing for several years different platforms and information systems that are not coordinated. And this is one of the other challenges that we need to understand and to tackle for making more effective decisions.
All right, thank you. So, Mechtel, the next question is to you. And this is a multi-leveled question, right? Because from where you sit in Germany, you're coordinating across multiple ministries, which you said you've already done that part. But there's both a federal level and there's coordination with the Länder, right, in Germany. At the same time, Germany is one of the leaders in the European Union. So then there's a supranational coordination within the EU. And Germany is one of the major donors to developing countries. So there's also lessons of how are you supporting developing country partners. There's a lot there, but what's working? And what lessons have you learned from Germany's experience?
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for the invitation to be here, and congratulations to this wonderful WWF project. And I think this idea of breaking up the silos, this is so important. And this is what we try to do on all the levels. I may start and share something about our national action plan on nature-based solutions for climate and biodiversity. This is one instrument that we use to really look into all the areas, into climate into mitigation for climate, into biodiversity protection, and into adaptation. And we have done this with all the ministries as a government program. It's running and it's financed with 3.5 billion euros until 2028 so far. And what we did is we looked into all the areas. We tried to cover all the ecosystems, to look into the cross-cutting issues. And one important example is peatland conservation, where we do peatland re-wetting. And it's important that we not only think about what we need to do, but who we need to do it with. So we think from the perspective of the land users. We try to take them on board, but we also coordinate with Ministry of Agriculture, with the Länder, and try to get all these different areas into one big effort. We have new regulation on the EU level, for example, the restoration law, or also the CRCF, which is for crediting carbon removals. And we try to think all of this together, how to implement this on the national level and not to have those things counteract each other. This is why we put up a working group which comprises all the federal ministries, but also the experts from the Länder, and we try to take everybody on board. So it's not only about breaking up the silos from the different thematic areas, it's also about breaking up the silos in the ministries, within the ministries, and also between the ministries. This is what I think is very important. And if we look into the challenges that we have almost the same challenges on the national, the EU, and the international level, because we have to talk about finance. We need finance. It's very, very important that we have good mechanisms. Germany is also on the international level putting 1.5 billion euros per year into the biodiversity conservation. On the other hand, we not only have to talk about finance, we have to talk about multilateral cooperation. We have the ENACT initiative. We have those great results from Cali that we have now to carry into the climate community, and we're working on this right here. We have to work with all our partners, and also it's important for me that we look into what kind of incentives do we have on all the levels. And we have good incentives that we have to strengthen, and on the other hand, we have incentives that really counteract our efforts. And we are also working, therefore, on looking into the LULUCF regulations, seeing what is working well and where do we have wrong incentives. And one example I would like to give is bioenergy, because with bioenergy at the moment, we allocate the emissions in the LULUCF sector, and those emissions are higher than the emissions from burning fossil fuels. But we do not see these emissions if we talk about bioenergy, because we say, oh, it's a zero-emission technology, but it is not. And I think it's very, very important that we take all those pieces and make a big picture and see what is helping us and what is really pulling us into the wrong direction. If we get a huge demand for biomass energetic use, then we will not be able to meet any of our targets. But the good thing is we have the solutions at hand, we have the nature-based solutions, and we have to get this narrative out. This is our chance. We have to tell people, if we want to solve the climate crisis, we have to solve the biodiversity crisis at the same time. Neither of those two will work on their own.
Thank you. So that is the point, right? So let's turn to Brazil, where I think we're going to see this play out. One of the good news pieces that came out last week was Brazil's NDC, that looking ahead is going to cut emissions reductions, we're hoping somewhere between 60 and 65%. I've seen an analysis that says at least half of that can be delivered by the land use sector through a combination of reducing deforestation and reforestation or regrowth of vegetation in savannas and what have you. So how does the integration now between biodiversity and climate, the NDCs, the NBSAPs, et cetera, work in Brazil? And should we be as optimistic as the press releases say?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here. It's very nice I am a panda, so it's very nice to be in our home. And so from Brazilian point of view, first of all, it's nice to have both conventions together, of course. I was, remember that I was not in the COP 1, but I was in COP 13, 14, so on. And at that time, I talked with a Brazilian leader of negotiation of Brazil at that time, and asked him about biodiversity, because we were discussing about REDD+, and in REDD we have the word biodiversity. And he told me, no, look, here, this convention will not talk about biodiversity. If we resolve the questions about carbon, let biodiversity out, only on this CDB. And so after a few years, now you can see we have at least some bridges, very clear bridges. That's very, very good. And it's important for me, from this point of view, as international, to see what kind of bridges, the integration as for activities, for outputs, outcomes, that for very welcome. But of course, we need to take care on finance things, of course. We need to have transparency in this way. We don't want to merge the finance of biodiversity with the finance that we are discussing here this week. So for me, it's different. We need to have a long time, and we need to see the transparency in this kind of finance flows that will come through, if in fact they will come. And a second, from Brazil NDC that we released last week, Brazil recognized the links between climate change and biodiversity. That's good. The IPOC, the discussions of biodiversity and adaptation too, even a national CBDR that I really love it. But of course we need more. And I believe that in our NDC, we have some things that we know that we can do more, not only on our deforestation commitment to end the deforestation, all the deforestation on the country by 2030, and of course we should increase our reforestation, and that's important for especially when we are thinking on the trade sector, that we have how the traceability about this sector. It's important to us. We don't want to have bioenergy linked with deforestation as we have now. So we need to have the traceability on that. Because of that, the UEDR law is very, very important for us in Brazil, especially coming from civil society. Of course, I understand the questions about the international trade that Brazil government say every time, every day. But from our point of view and our perspective to really outcome this kind of input to end the deforestation in Brazil and stop the links between deforestation and agriculture, UDR law is one very important key point for us. And last of all, I really believe that Brazil, as the leader for the next year of the negotiation, as the president, I think that Brazil, as after COP28, when we released the GST results and we get transition away from fossil fuel, that might be Brazil could lead something, the discussion saying the transition away from AFOLU sector. Let's discuss that in other countries too. Could we have an AFOLU discussion about transition away? Could Brazil lead that, this kind of thing? This is the point. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So next I want to turn to Ante. So IDB, there's been a real evolution in the role and thinking of the MDBs over the last year, particularly since the joint statement in Glasgow. And IDB has been a leader in that evolution about increasing the importance of nature in their portfolios. So IDB co-led the task force that came up with the metrics on how to measure this. A few weeks ago in Cali, IDB announced that they've now done their homework and are investing something like $2 billion in nature and biodiversity last year. The new report from the MDBs on climate finance says you're investing about $6 billion in the climate space. How do those fit together, and what are the roles of the MDBs in ensuring both increasing the nature positivity and the support for net zero in your portfolios, and how do those fit together, and how do we ensure accountability?
Let me take off the headphones for a little bit so I don't hear myself and I don't hear my mistakes. Well, so good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me and inviting the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, to this panel. Always a pleasure to sit down with Brazil and Colombia. It's not the first time, actually, during this convention that I find myself in the space where these two countries are leading the charge on several fronts, especially on the road to Belém and coming from Cali as well. So we are sandwiched in the middle there with Azerbaijan, but hopefully we're going to get some decisions coming out of this COP. Indeed, you know, the Inter-American Development Bank in Cali announced that last year we reached $2 billion in investments for nature-related finance. And what does that mean on the synergistic front, on how it's implemented in reality? And just to give you some context to everybody that is here, I am based in Suriname, in Paramaribo. So I'm next to Brazil. Suriname, for those of you who doesn't know too much about the country, is 93% a forested country, completely Amazon country. So when it comes to nature financing, and what we have seen with the Inter-American Development Bank is that Latin America and the Caribbean has 40% of the nature and biodiversity that is contributed to the global stage. So this region has a myriad of solutions when it comes to, for example, the creation of jobs that offer ecosystem services, also biodiversity and bioeconomy opportunities in the region, a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurship and small and medium businesses. So when it comes to the IDB creating that accountability, in the last years we have revised a lot of our safeguards. And the first topic that I want to tackle is stakeholder engagement. So when we are reviewing at the Inter-American Development Bank the safeguards for environmental and social investments, First of all, we look into how we are conducting consultations prior to designing projects and prior to deciding on investing in any particular space in the Amazon or in anywhere in Latin America. We have looked into the ways we are talking to the communities. We're looking into the ways we are designing those consultations, how we're engaging and financial institutions, how we bring in the different actors, not only the governments, but also the different agencies and NGOs that have a very strong presence in the communities. So we have looked into, first of all, the stakeholder engagement. Number two, we're looking very closely at the beyond and do not harm principles, but we're going into the do good principles. So what does that mean? That we're not only looking into assessing what kind of impact, negative or positive, an investment may have in the country, but we're also looking beyond into, okay, what kind of other opportunities for social and environmental benefits can be brought to the community. For example, if we're looking into a solar project in the Caribbean, in a specific community, in a remote area of the country, let's say Guyana or Trinidad or Barbados, we're looking into what other opportunities can we bring of vocational training, of training of women, people with disabilities. How do we bring the different vulnerable groups into the benefits of a project and put together the same as we are looking into investing in renewable energy, creating projects around the main project to promote education, training, bioeconomy, entrepreneurship. So really trying to make a good impact in the projects that we finance. Number three, we're working a lot and taking our time in assessing prior the design of the project what are going to be the impacts on biodiversity. What kind of species, what kind of animals, what kind of ecosystem services are in the place that we're seeking to target for financing. And we're taking time in assessing and doing environmental impact assessments, putting more financing. So part of this financing that we are committing, we are also using it to create the space for more assessments, for more studies, for taking the time for consultations and really understanding what we're doing and not just coming and forcing a solution without getting that bottom to top approach and listening to the people that are going to stand as beneficiaries. And fourth, I think it's very important to mention that even though we have to work on different metrics for climate finance and biodiversity finance, which is still a process that is happening, at the IDB we have been very serious about the exclusion lists. We do not finance fossil fuels to start with. We do not finance anything that would really directly affect and is not aligned with Paris Agreement. We take very seriously Paris Agreement. So we are working in every time that we are looking into financing any project that is closely linked to biodiversity or closely linked to nature or climate. We take our time also in analyzing how does this align with the climate goals of the country. And I have to tell you that I am in the country office in Suriname, looking into transport, infrastructure, energy, health, education projects, and each of these projects need to be analyzed for Paris alignment. And that is an analysis that we go very, very deep into to make sure that there is that synergy between the two agendas, which are not separate, are coming more and more interlinked. And as we move forward into accountability and transparency, I think climate and biodiversity metrics are going to become even more important for us, especially as we design projects. We're looking very closely into the results matrix and connecting the outcomes of these indicator outcomes into biodiversity benefits. So we are putting a lot of pressure on ourselves as well as banks and as institutions. We are not we're similar in a way that we're also working through our coordination, internal coordination, our internal units. We're creating a biodiversity dedicated unit at the bank just to make the point that this is becoming a very strong agenda. It's one of the pillars of our Impact Plus framework, and we're moving towards improving ourselves as the commitments are more established and more advanced.
Thank you. And if I could just point out one pat on the back to IDB with the new strategy on biodiversity and natural capital. What I think is really interesting is that it's treating biodiversity as both its own sector and as something that's cross-cutting and needs to be integrated into all the other sectors, which seems like the right approach for the MDBs. So congratulations on the new strategy there. Alexandra, I'm going to ask you the hard question, which is about the trade-offs, because it's easy to talk about promoting synergies as if it's all win-wins all the time, everywhere. But when we're talking about nature-based solutions, we're talking about interventions in the food systems, we're talking about potentially work with the oceans, we're talking about restoration. There can be big competition for land use. We've heard an example about challenges in the LULUCF sector around bioenergy. So if it's not an all rosy win-win all the time, how do we manage those trade-offs? And what's the advice and guidance you have to governments about how to manage those in a smart way?
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for the invitation, and it's actually really exciting because I started working on this climate and biodiversity linkage 5 years ago, and I remember at COP25 precisely interacting with WWF experts who had put out a report on the 3 IPCC and IPBES work. So, and then the other thing I'm really happy to be in this panel because also in the work that we've been doing at IDRI for the past 5 years, when we were talking about sort of aligning high ambition climate and biodiversity across sort of governance, it really struck us that one key element was really to break the silos nationally. So it's really exciting to hear a few years later that countries are really starting to do this. So after that, I'll say with a caveat that I work more at the international level, but I think it's also, I mean, I see, so I might not have that much to say with regards to how do you address specific trade-offs on the ground, because as I understand, it's really context specific and also like sort of on the immediate term. But I think having the bigger international picture in mind is also really essential, because I think when we talk about the climate and biodiversity crisis and how we address it and the synergies and trade-offs, I mean, to me, there's really an element of a long-term perspective that we need to keep in mind, and a global perspective that perhaps is more difficult to keep in mind when you're working at the national level, even though, of course, the long-term strategies, I think, are really essential, as was mentioning Manuel at the beginning. So I guess and so maybe just to start in terms of the trade-offs, I think there is a very clear imperative from the science. So from the IPCC IPBES report that came out a few years ago, and also more science more recently talking about this. And then also I just wanted to mention that in the Cali decision, this need to minimize trade-offs between climate and biodiversity was reiterated twice, and actually is part of the Target 8 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So there's a clear, I think, understanding on the biodiversity side. There hasn't been that language clearly in any UNFCCC COP decisions, and I think that reflects the lack of commitment to that at the moment here. I guess I would say I've been thinking a lot about also about narrative and like how do we present the climate and biodiversity linkages, because after working on this for 5 years more in the climate space internationally, I just still see that, for instance, mitigation negotiators, when you talk to them about how critical it's to address these two together, biodiversity still sounds very fluffy and nature, and it just seems like they think of it still today as this sort of nice option that's like nice to have in addition, but is not truly essential to meeting the 1.5 goals. So sort of in that perspective, I'm also thinking beyond the question of trade-offs. It just occurred to me this morning that beyond that, I think also it's maybe really essential to keep in mind that key things we're talking about here is actually lose-lose situations between climate and biodiversity. Because I would say, for instance, clearly the two that I see, and I guess it's another way of saying synergies, but maybe it might be interesting to shift that perspective. To me, the first clear lose-lose is delaying fossil fuel phase-out, just because, clearly we know that is what is, phasing out fossil fuels is essential to keep the 1.5 goal without overshooting it. And yes, there's new science that is very clear that overshooting 1.5, which is the path that we're pretty much on at the moment, will have massive, potentially irreversible impacts on ecosystems and on communities. And also, what's very clear as well is that collectively, at the moment, countries in their NDCs and long-term strategies are banking on going to a overshoot scenario and then using a lot of land-based removals to bring down back the temperature. And the land gap report was really, I think, pivotal in showing this a year and a half ago, showing that at the moment countries are banking on using 1 billion hectares of land collectively, globally, to suck up that carbon because they are delaying fossil fuel phase out. And that is pretty much more land than the EU, Turkey, and many other countries. So I think that, to me, that's still something that's kind of a blind spot in this bigger picture. So I would say, in other words, that a major synergy is between climate and biodiversity is phasing out fossil fuels. And sometimes we don't think about it because, of course, when we think about nature, it's more like the actual land. So I guess that's one of the things I would say. I think this whole question of, and I think keeping in mind this bigger picture is really important to understand also that when we're talking about removals and what do we expect the land sector to do to keep the 1.5 goal and to make reach our climate resilience goals as well, we need to start with the question of mitigation hierarchy. I really think that's essential. The IPCC, even I think the GST had very clear also signal on first we need to conserve and then restore nature. And we need to first be, especially to this 2030 time frame, we need to be first really focusing on halting deforestation before we start thinking about massive carbon removals and credits, as we have seen a lot of excitement here, I think, on Article 6 and removals, and I think that is actually quite misguided, because when you take the bigger picture in mind and you see that we just don't have that land, and if we're not going to overshoot 1.5, then we can't be, it just doesn't add up in terms of math to be offset, buying carbon credits, using the land to sort of offset current fossil fuel emissions. And I think, again, my message is never very positive, but I think it's sort of here, all these issues are so complex and people are fortunately working very in-depth in every one of these, but I think keeping this bigger picture in mind is essential. And this brings me perhaps to COP30, which is, I think one of the key roles that the international space can play in the UNFCCC is really to send signals to have this global direction. And I think that connecting that back to also what countries can do, I think actually the two of the key signals in the GST were transitioning away from fossil fuels and halting deforestation. And to have that translated in the NDCs would be really essential. And also coming back to these negotiations, having then bringing that sort of how countries are doing it on the ground, bringing back that accountability to the global space is also key. So for instance, at the moment, the UAE dialogue on following up on GST is there's a lot of tension because some countries are not wanting to have that clear follow-up internationally. Maybe I will end in terms of just saying, one of the other things we have been working on at IDRI, so my colleague here, Marta, has been working with her colleagues on a lot of long-term strategies. And one of the things I've been saying for several years is how key it would be to integrate that biodiversity element in the climate long-term strategies, because I think it's at the long term that you see those trade-offs. But that has been very challenging. So yeah, I wish I had, I mean, I think there are some good messages because we are still at a point where we can act, but I think keeping that bigger picture and really reframing the narrative so that the whole question of how nature is essential actually gets seen as a real essential element rather than this fluffy thing. That's what I want to be working on over the next year. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've only got a few minutes till I'm going to hand over to Adil to wrap up. So I think we've got time for one or two questions. But I just want to call out, what I'm sort of hearing is three different key themes here. And so one was the question, it's not just what we want to do, but it's who we want to do it with. We heard that from Mechthild, we heard that from Anate. Second was this notion of needing to reframe the narrative around what mitigation looks like to ensure synergies and the importance of biodiversity and nature solutions. And then the third is one of the key tools in doing this is the use of the mitigation hierarchy and that sort of integrated planning to deal with impacts. I'm sure there are more. Those are just three key messages that came out that I heard. So let me open it up. We've got a few minutes left before we head to our closing speaker. Are there any questions out there that you all want to pose to the audience or to the panelists? Noelle?
Hi, thank you all. That was really, really great. I suppose thinking about that bigger picture and the kind of commitments that we have through essentially the Global Biodiversity Framework's mission and from business and finance to nature positive, from anyone's perspective, how do you put that together alongside net zero commitments from a one actor, one sector, one country, one bank's perspective? How are you working to understand, to map, and then track your contribution to nature positive? Because it's a global goal, and we have to work out how collectively we're going to reach it. So it's very complicated and lots of misunderstanding and greenwash about it. But if that's our big picture, so how are we collectively, from your different perspectives, kind of working towards that, I guess? Thanks.
Anyone want to take that, or we can just go down the line? But Anate?
Yeah, I would like to again emphasize that committing finance is just the first step, and sometimes it's insufficient. When a multilateral development bank commit finances, let's say a process starts. And again, I have to emphasize the importance of biodiversity metrics and linking the results frameworks of projects, the results outcomes, to biodiversity indicators. So when we are investing in a renewable energy project, or let's say, for example, in Guyana, we're investing in a flood management project, and there's an opportunity for nature-based solutions application in the project, that's an indicator that we need to link. And when we do those links from design, then we're better able to continue monitoring and tracking if the finance is indeed going to the biodiversity positive addition, I wouldn't say additionality, but to the impact on biodiversity that we're seeking. And that will be tracked or captured in the monitoring reports of projects, in implementation, working along with the governments, in our case with the borrowers or the beneficiaries, and that's how we start the process of really tracking and ensuring that accountability is not only about the big announcement on financing, but really making it work and making it happen.
Can I take it? Yeah, okay. So I think that coming from the private sector, traceability is one very important, and then we can know where is the deforestation is coming from. We're developing a land map for the whole country, who is the owner of the what, and this is important to know where is deforestation is going through. And of course, when we have forests, so you can see the biodiversity is quite easy. But when we are doing a reforestation process, it's quite difficult. But of course, we can, during the time, of course, depends on what biomes we are working with, we can have more clarity. We are in Brazil, we have our red list, we do our inventory of biodiversity, so we can, in land use planning, we can reach both results, I think. Thank you.
Yes, I will try to give a very quick answer just from the national perspective. I think it's very important that we look into all the different strategies and have the indicators and our evaluation of the plans matching with each other. And this is what we are doing. We look at the NBS, the National Biodiversity Strategy, the Adaptation Plan, and our Climate Action Program, and have all of them aligned. And for example, for the Climate Action Program, we are going to have, for the land use part, a review next year, and we will see whether we are on track. We already know we are not on track, and we will go and have additional measures in place.
I just would say that for us, improving bioeconomy and economic indicators on biodiversity is going to be key, because we are facing these challenges of transition from fossil fuel economies and also building on halting deforestation and improving well-being for people that lives between and among biodiversity, and we need to start using economy and building economy from our natural capital to develop ourselves.
Alexandra, last word?
Yes, I guess I would say in terms of carbon dioxide removal, so afforestation, reforestation credits. So from a company perspective, I feel like the amount that we have is very limited, and so they should not be. I mean, I think like a company, like for instance, the bigger buyer of these removal credits is, for instance, Microsoft. Microsoft does not have, as far as I know, truly hard to abate. I mean, they're not in that final hard to abate emissions, such as like hard industry, that you cannot reduce emissions. So we need to be using those credits for, the highest climate value. That's what I would say.
Thank you. So let me just ask you all to give a quick round of applause to our panel before I hand over to our last speaker. Thanks. And with that, I'm going to introduce Adil Najam, who's the president of WWF International, to say a few words to close us out.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you everyone for those wonderful ideas, but even more than that, for all that you do, even beyond these COPs. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to be very, very quick, but I hope you will allow me to first say something before I come back to nature and climate. To my WWF colleagues here, I've been here most of last week, and this is my last event. I literally rushed from here to the airport. The reason I say this is I've been at a lot of COPs. I was actually at COP -2, there was such a thing, and at Rio, and so on and so forth. These things can be very depressing. But recent COPs have been especially important for me because I get to see the magic of the pandas and the magic of the network. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of you for all you do. And I know not everyone here is a panda, so by the powers vested in me as president of WWF, all of you are now honorary pandas. And by that, what I mean is, what I mean by that is that it's not about panda or not. It's not about WWF. There is a magic that happens at these things. It can be frustrating, but it is the magic of people coming together to push ideas for the negotiators, but also to push ideas beyond the negotiators, right? And that is what I want to talk. So I want to take right from where Manuel had left, which is what is happening here, and also take it beyond this, right? I can promise you this week will end. I hope this week will end in a good way. I hope we will get the text you want on climate nature. But what I can promise you is there will be a next Monday. And you will have to continue working on that next Monday for climate nature. right? And I think that is something very, very important to keep in mind. And the reason I say that is the following, and I'll be very quick about this, but I do think it is important. I think the timing is right for climate nature. I say climate nature because I like this climate nature much better than I like climate and nature. Climate and nature makes it sound as if those are two opposite things that do not talk to each other, that somehow we have to bring them together. I think that's a very arrogant idea. That cub in that beautiful picture is going to be impacted by climate change as much as my children are, whether you do something here or not. That field is going to impact climate change as much as many other forms of emission, whether we do something or not. And I think that's the realization the world is coming to, that nature is not a place out there that you sit in a car and go and watch. Nature is everywhere. Nature is what we eat, nature is what we drink, nature is what we breathe. Nature is where climate happens, right? And that these synergies are how nature actually works. The reason I mention this is I think we are at a moment when that realization is setting in. The time is right. The time is right because of COP16 and what it did. The time is right because of what COP29 can do. The time is right because of what the NDCs can do. The time is right because of what UNEA has put in. But I think the time is right because whether they like it or not, the world is realizing that these silo solutions aren't working. I don't know if any of colleagues from WWF Pakistan are here. I saw some of them. But the reason I mentioned that, just like your work, the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, just awarded what is, I think, a $77 million project to WWF Pakistan, mostly from GCF. The reason I mention it is the following. I just learned that it is the second largest project ever for GCF, which is the Climate Fund. It's a nature-based solutions project. It doesn't have the word carbon in it. It doesn't have the word climate in it. It is about both. It is called Recharge Pakistan. What I'm saying is that we are coming to this realization that we need a different sort of solutions. Now that is an opportunity, but here is what I was telling my colleagues from our Pakistan office. It's an opportunity, but it's also a responsibility, and you should be a little scared. So we have been selling the story, I think it's the right story, that climate nature synergies are going to give us better results. Now we will have to prove the concept. The world, especially the young people in the world, are going to hold us to the fire and say, you said these things work. Now show us how they work. Right? In some ways, that's what I meant by the Monday after this. We don't have to wait. I hope these treaties will do what they should. But every biodiversity project should always think of what it means for climate. No climate project should ever not think of how it impacts nature. This is not a slogan. This is how we got into the problem. Right? Remember how we got into the problem? We got into the problem because we started making policies in silos. We made energy policy without thinking what it would do to climate. We started doing forest policy without thinking what it would do to this cup. We started doing biodiversity policy maybe without thinking what it would do to the community. Right? And now I think in this moment of planetary crises, right? Remember this word that we keep talking about? I think there is a demand in this hall and all across the world that if indeed there is a planetary crisis, if there are these polycrises, right? There is a planetary crisis. If there are these polycrises, these multiple crises, then we need poly-solutions. Then we need multiple policy solutions. Right? That is not about the turf, this is for climate and this is for biodiversity and that is for forests and this is for land. Right? The treaty structure needs to talk as Manuel was talking about. Right? It's not about merging or not merging. It is about talking. It is eventually about realizing there is only one planet and the news from that planet is it's not doing very well. That is the responsibility that brings all of us here. Thank you, everyone, for doing everything you do, and have a great week.